Welcome back to Talking Dragon Age, the show where I talk about Dragon Age. Today, we talk about the Qunari. The race, I mean, not the religion. Well, I guess a little of both. This probably won't be the only video I make on them, but I'll still try to cover as much as possible. First things first. Kossith. Okay, look, here's a discussion featuring the writers of Dragon Age, and I'm including a link to this in the description. Here they explain why the word Kossith does not describe the horned, white-haired race. Mary Kirby explains it best. Here she says, Kossith is an antiquated term, not a technical one. It was used to describe the culture that predated the Qun. It may not have even been the name of the race at all. It's the equivalent of calling white people Occidental. A few members of the Qunari priesthood are going to recognize the word, but no one else in Thedas would know what the heck this term means. Further on, we read that Kossith most likely refers to Qunari ancestors, or those across the sea. Alright, now that that's out of the way, we can start looking into the Qunari's true origin. A couple of things to look at here. We of course have what Qunari says about them not being a race, but a mistake.
What do they call you? A Qunari? Your blood is engorged with decay. Your race is not a race. It is a mistake.
Then we also have Kieran's comment on them.
I noticed your blood. It doesn't belong to your people.
Then we have this scene with the Iron Bull.
You know, Qunari hold dragons sacred. Well, as much as we hold anything sacred. Atashi, the glorious ones. That's our word for them. Atashi.
Why do you think the Qunari think of dragons that way?
Well, you know how we have horns. We kind of look more dragony than most people. Maybe it's that. But a few of the Ben Hasrath have this crazy old theory. See, the Tamasrans control who we mate with. They breed us for jobs like you'd breed dogs or horses. What if they mixed in some dragon a long time ago? Maybe drinking the blood, maybe magic, I don't know. But something in that dragon we killed spoke to me.
Now let's add this.
I like your horns, the Iron Bull. But they're dragon horns, not bull horns. You could have named yourself the Iron Dragon.
Oh. Shit. That would have been better.
Is there any reason dragon blood smells good to you?
Nothing I know of. Always had a thing for dragons, though. Most Qunari do. Maybe there's something tying us to them, deep in the blood. Or maybe it's just the dragons are really badass.
Let's also take this into account. Most Qunari that abandon the Qun become savages.
Qunari are savage creatures. Their ferocity held in check only by the rigid teachings of the Qun.
When Qunari can't handle the fighting in Saharan or lose faith in the Qun, they go rogue. They flee into the wilderness and turn into bandits, attacking everyone. They're vicious, savage. You look at them and you can see why my people needed the Qun to stay civilized.
Now let's back up to that other scene with Bull.
It's a shame we had to kill the dragon.
Damn good fight. Dragons are the embodiment of raw power. But it's all uncontrolled. Savage. So, they need to be destroyed. Taming the wild. Order out of chaos. Have another drink.
So here we are. Cole can see that their horns are dragon horns. Kieran knows that their blood does not belong to them. Corypheus speaks of them as though they're unnatural, artificial, created. The Qunari turn savage unless they have something to adhere to. Unless they find purpose in something, they are doomed to their savage nature. That's why they need the Qun. They need something to serve because they were created to serve. Given what Kieran, Cole, and the Bull have said, I think some people combined dragon DNA with something else in order to use them as slaves. But how do the Kossith fit into this? Well, I found mention that a group of Kossith settled near the Qunari wilds before the first Blight, and it's believed that they became the first ogres. So, perhaps it was the Kossith that were experimented on. The Kossith then became the horned race we call Qunari because the ancient people of Thedas combined their DNA with that of dragons. But this would mean that the Kossith have no direct Darkspawn counterparts. Ogres are a result of Qunari broodmothers, and if the Kossith aren't Qunari, that would mean that their conversion into Qunari took place before the first Blight, which lines up perfectly with the fact that Corypheus knew of the Qunari's true origin. So, what are the Kossith? Well, we can say with certainty that the Qunari came from somewhere else, somewhere over this way. That is the home continent of the Kossith. We don't know the name of this continent, but I kind of want to call it Kossitha, something like that. I should also mention that it is theorized that the Kossith are actually a group of races. Maybe, maybe not. I'm inclined to think so, especially if the Qunari were indeed some kind of hybrid between Kossith and dragons. But let's look at the Codex entry for the Qun. It tells the story of Kozloon and how he traveled to many different cities and nations and observed both their greatness and their folly. That is what led him to write his tome and give birth to the Qun. But because this is obviously before the Qunari's arrival in Thedas, everywhere he went would have had to have been part of the Kossith's continent. But a few things don't quite add up. If the Qunari were Kossith who came to Thedas and were subsequently transformed, how did they get back to their home continent, proceed to create their own religion, and then get exiled back to Thedas, especially if they'd have turned savage without a purpose? I'm going to try to break this down. Now that I think about it, there's no guarantee that Kozloon was actually one of these horned giants. If he was actually human or something, then I guess he could have traveled Thedas. But I'm still inclined to think he was Qunari, or at least a Kossith, because, well, that's where the Qunari came from. I mean, if we consider what the Qunari are like without the Qun, without purpose, it makes total sense that Kozloon would seek out that certainty. It's said that Qunari, as Kossith, prayed to gods, but that practice was outlawed within the Qun when it was established. In fact, the Qun doesn't outright contradict the possibility of a higher power, it's just that the Qunari don't believe that. It's possible that the Qunari lasted for a long time under the Kossith's religion, but Kozloon, in all his observations, thought that wasn't enough, as it didn't directly solve every problem, like poverty and crime. Perhaps the rise of the Qun is what drove his people into exile, knowing that they couldn't defeat the full force of the Kossith. So maybe that's why they came to Parvalan, intending to conquer Thedas as the Kossith were too powerful. That is speculation, and while it does make sense, at least to me, there's not much hard evidence to support it. Then again, there's not much hard evidence to de-support it either. Unsupport? De-support. Words. So, with that considered, I give this theory a rating of, I hope I'm right, because that would be awesome. So, the Qunari are now occupying the island known as Parvalan, and there's a pretty interesting codex entry about it called the Pyramids of Parvalan. I'm not going to read the whole thing aloud, but here are some of the highlights. Apparently, there are ancient paintings on Parvalan that depict tall, horned figures, always in a position of authority and or respect. The codex entry states that these may have been people wearing ornamental headdresses, or were perhaps deities. There are only a few known cultures that use headdresses like that. The Adaar are one, and perhaps they inherited that practice from their precursors, the Alamari. And I guess Flemeth does this weird thing with her hair, and Gillinan is usually depicted with hollow horns, though those are quite different in shape. But that could match up with something else that stands out about the pyramids, and that they are arranged in accordance to the constellation Solium. Solium's codex entry states that one of the two main theories about its origin is that it's meant to represent Elganon, who was considered the eldest of the sun. Although that theory doesn't quite match the connection to the paintings because Flemeth and Gillinan are the only ones ever depicted with anything resembling horns, at least according to my studies. The other theory about Solium is that it comes from the Naromenian tribes that preceded Tevinter, as they had a fascination with everything in the sky, and the constellation is meant to represent the sun and or the moon. But why bother highlighting these stars? If the sun and the moon fascinate you, aren't they enough on their own? Why do you also need to chart a constellation? But if that theory is correct, as is the theory that humans originally came from Lavellan, it would make sense that these same people built the pyramids, but for what purpose? Without more information, all we have is guesswork. But they must have had good reason for building these mathematically perfect pyramids in reflection to the constellation. Solium's Codex entry states that it's entirely possible that neither of these ideas are true, which I'm inclined to believe because the two presented here don't quite match up with the pyramids. I think the only way to figure out who charted the constellation is to figure out who built the pyramids and vice versa. We'll also need to figure out what exactly the paintings are meant to represent. I'm inclined to think they're deities, but until we get more information, hopefully by exploring these ruins ourselves, we can't really know any of this for sure. But why does this matter? I think it matters because the Qunari conquered Lavellan with relative ease. That probably means that the figures depicted in the paintings were very important to the Lavellan natives, which, I should add, included both humans and the Fex. Alright, I think it's time to start bringing all this together. So let's recap. Qunari need to serve because they were created to serve. Whether they were once Kossith remains unclear, yet probable. All we know for sure is that at some point they did travel to the Kossith's continent and would have stayed there for over 1,000 years. Alright, so let's establish a timeline. First came the Kossith's arrival in Thedas. This would have been around the height of Tevinter's power, and shortly before the first Blight, which lines up perfectly with the Corypheus thing. Tevinter did have settlements in southern Ferelden, and we know that it was around this time that the Kossith vanished from the wilds. It's possible that Tevinter simply killed them all, or the Blight did, or maybe the Alamari, or, faced with all this conflict, the Kossith simply uprooted their colony and returned home. But evidence shows that the Qunari were artificially created, and Corypheus's comment combined with the timeline would indicate that ancient Tevinter were the culprits of this. And because we know that at least some of the Qunari wound up back on the Kossith's continent after their creation, it makes sense that they either were Kossith before the transformation, or the Kossith adopted them when they returned home. So let me see if I got this. Corypheus knew of the Qunari from ancient times. Various sources connect Qunari to dragons, Kull, Bull, etc. But the Qunari obviously also have a connection to the Kossith as they came from that continent about 300 years ago. Therefore, the most likely scenario I see is that the Kossith from the colony in the wilds were captured and experimented on using dragon's blood. Then, around the time the Blight first appeared, they returned to their home continent. Over the course of the next 1,000 years, they proceeded to establish the Qun before being driven back to Thedas when they conquered Lavellan. Okay, this is all making sense to me, so if you guys have any different ideas, be sure to let me know in the comments. I always love to read them. So that's it for now, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, Tala Nadas.